Hey everyone, working author here. I was wanting to put together a little thing based off of a blog I wrote maybe a couple weeks ago, specifically how to outline a book. It's something that's kind of daunting. I mean, just the idea of even writing a book is scary, let alone actually really digging in. So I figured I would address some of the nitty gritty that goes on when outlining a book and why it's so important. So, one of the most difficult things about writing a book is taking a good idea, which would be, say, your elevator pitch, and then just stretching it out, making it into this massive 150,000 word novel. Your typical great, big size novel. The problem that people have when they do this is that they jump into the project thinking they have to have every single conversation mapped out. Every scene, every action, every minutia needs to be set into stone, set into place. The only problem with that is that no one can actually do that, except maybe John Milton. So to get around that problem or that desire that you have to make sure that everything is together, everything is in line before you write, I wanted to help by presenting this. If we started with an elevator pitch, I bet you I could stretch it out into an entire novel, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that right now. So, every man, Mr. Smith, goes to Washington. It's probably familiar. You're probably familiar with the Jimmy Stewart movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This is going to be a deviation from that plot, but it's a very archetypical story, and it's one that can probably be easily rendered regardless of time period because it follows some very rudimentary basic acts of storytelling. So, yeah, I mean, it's essentially, if you look at the plot of the movie, it starts with an everyman with ambition, journeys out of his comfort zone, becomes disillusioned, confronts his disillusionment, and then grows from that experience. That's why I chose this example. We're going to do what I call elastic storytelling. Most people, when they want to write a book, they have a good idea of where they want it to go. And usually there's 2 or 3 marquee scenes that when you approach these scenes, you have them so detailed and so ingrained in your mind that you could write in your sleep. It's almost kind of like a movie trailer, like a movie trailer incidentally will show you all the best parts of the movie, but then when you go actually see the movie, then you're like, oh, that sucks, like all the good parts are in the trailer. The nice thing about having those marquee scenes is that that's like the glue that you can use to frame this entire story. So the problem then becomes what goes in between these marquee scenes. How do you take something that you think is really compelling and interesting and give that context? That's essentially where we're going with this. So to address this, you need an outline for your book, hence outlining. So this is the way that I do outlining. It can be different for anybody. Everyone has their own method. This is how I do it. And I wanted to show you how I did it in hopes that it helps you and makes you a better writer. So what I do is I start with 3-sentence summaries for each chapter. The benefit of doing it this way is that you explore the entire plot very quickly without too much effort or even commitment. It's a good practice because when you do it this way, you can see the whole story from like a 50,000 foot view. You get to see the grand track of the narrative from start to finish. And what I do, and I do this very mechanically, and I'll explain that later, but what I do is I usually pick a set amount of chapters to work with. So in this example, I chose 10 chapters, but you could do 10, 12, 15, however many you want. The reason why you decide right at the start how many chapters you want is because it helps you with pacing. Like if you're going through your chapters and your chapter 6 of 10, and then all of a sudden you're either just starting the book or you've entered into a scene where it's going to be very close to the end, or it's moving too slow, or it gives you this idea of kind of where you are in the story and in any given time in relation to the end of the book. Nice thing about defining it this way is because if you define where the ending of the story goes, it allows you to approach that with a lot of momentum and a lot of intensity. That's also probably one of the things that people suck at when they write, is that they can't end a story. They can tell the whole thing, but how do you wrap it up and how do you make it this pristine scene of the entire story? So in this instance, I'm going to do a 10 chapter layout, and we'll go ahead and we'll read the outline. So chapter 1. Mr. Smith is encouraged by his local congregation to explore local politics in lieu of his grandfather's historic tenure as the first mayor of the town. He talks to a local councilman to get pointers. Mr. Smith runs for mayor and gets elected narrowly. After 1 year of serving as mayor, this is chapter 2. Chapter 2. After 1 year of serving as mayor, he meets with state officials to discuss a new highway that will be running through his county. Edward McElroy, the representative of his congressional district, is attending. They hit it off and discuss politics, leaving Mr. Smith wondering what more he can do for his country. Chapter 3. Mr. Smith announces at a press conference that he wants to run for the U.S. House of Representatives. He challenges the incumbent of his district, the very same McElroy. They have a series of town hall debates, with the last one, Smith challenging McElroy directly. Chapter 4. With the help of harnessing the local community through piggybacking off of the goodwill earned by his grandfather, Mr. Smith faces a difficult election day. Smith goes door to door on election day early in the morning. Smith narrowly again wins the council district, or the state of representatives district. Chapter 5. Smith goes to Washington, D.C. and moves into his office. He meets his staff and other congressmen. Big players like the House Speaker and Minority Whip are eating lunch in the commissary and having a lively conversation about X. Chapter 6. Smith's first day in the House, still learning the social etiquette of his new job. Smith makes several mistakes. Smith votes against his party and gains some enemies. Chapter 7. Smith encounters corruption in both parties, with the Speaker and the Minority Whip taking concessions from two lobbying industries. Smith confronts them and is bitterly dismissed. Smith brings up his objections the following day regarding two pieces of legislation that are being debated. Chapter 8. The House Speaker and Minority Whip pass their laws successfully. Smith is discouraged and goes out to drink at a bar. The following day, reporters confront him and he is ashamed of his lack of decorum. Chapter 9. Smith reads a letter from one of his supporters and is reinvigorated, admitting fault in a public statement. An amendment to one of the laws that passed the previous day is proposed, which Smith filibusters. Smith collapses on the House floor and suffers a stroke. Chapter 10. Smith awakes 4 months later from a coma and learns about his example in the House. His willingness to stand by his principles garnered him sympathy, but also encouraged others to look into the House Speaker and Minority Whip. Extensive corruption is uncovered, and Smith is celebrated in his hometown. The end. So that's our outline. That's our 3-ish per chapter sentence outline. So where do you go from this point? The next point essentially is to forget what you saw here. Accept that this outline will change. What's going to happen is that as you fill in this outline, you're going to get all these new ideas. You're going to have new plot devices. You're going to have new characters. All these things are going to directly conflict with that original outline. And what you'll find is that while the previous exercise was very mechanical and very locked in and turnkey-ish, this next section that you'll go to is going to be more organic, because now you're moving from this mechanical structure and then now you're filling in the gaps, and that's where the organic narrative framework stuff happens. So when you actually write a chapter, when you move from, this broad outline to individual chapters, how do you just jump right into a chapter? What I do is I write my chapters in beats. And in order to explain kind of like what a beat is, they use a lot in comic books and television, things like that. But a beat is essentially an extended play-by-play of the chapter. It consolidates a chapter into like a series of actions and movements that compose the flow of action throughout the whole narrative of that unit. So assuming that this book that I just read off was something that I wanted to write about, having beats laid out in a chapter before you write it helps make sure that each chapter has its own sort of self-contained narrative. The nice thing too is that everything you write constitutes a solid scene where you can explore the character and their motivations. This also helps to defeat writer's block, most importantly, because you have a roadmap that you're going down. So what I did in this instance is that I rolled a dice, and my objective was to be as random as possible to show how robust this method is. So I rolled a dice, randomly got 6, used my D&D dices because I'm a geek like that. So in chapter 6, I originally laid out the first day of Mr. Smith in his freshman role. Assuming nothing has changed before I write anything concrete, I would jot out a series of beats for that chapter. And so here are the beats for that chapter. Smith is nervously smoking a cigarette in his dim office, trying to shake out his nerves. Helen, Smith's secretary, comes in, gives Smith an itinerary, and shows him into the chamber, feeling bad for his nerves. Smith enters the chamber almost late and takes his seat. The representative next to him is idly chatting with a fellow party member. Smith introduces himself. Then, trying to butt in on ongoing discussion over a bill, Smith is chastised by the House Speaker and Majority Whip for his indiscretion in decorum. Smith fumbles with his briefcase, spilling his papers on the floor. A bill is being discussed and brought to a final vote. One of the bill provisions will negatively affect members of his district and others in his home state. Smith voices his objections and votes against the bill. After the session, 2 of his fellow party members angrily accost him in the hall. They demand to know why Smith voted against them. When Smith divulges his reasons, the party members cruelly laugh in his face and insult him, saying that party above policy is what wins votes. To conclude, Smith's assistant bleakly smiles and escorts him back to his office. So in each of those little vignettes and those little building blocks of that chapter, you can already start to imagine certain things you'd want to do in that chapter. What are the 2 senators talking about when Mr. Smith takes his seat? What does Mr. Smith look like when he's smoking, chain smoking and shaking, in his office and everything before he's about to go out there? Is Mr. Smith married? We don't establish that previously, but if he isn't married, maybe Helen becomes a love interest in the story to flesh that out and give her some more characterization, give Mr. Smith more characterization. Also, that conflict between the 2 congressional members and himself, what is that scene going to look like as well? What can we draw on to make that more realistic, more interesting? That beating of your chapter helps to just tighten it up and everything. So after we've created this outline, we've done all these things that constitute a level of creativity, but not the ultimate creativity that will get you from elevator pitch to 150,000 words. How do you get to the end point? And I just say, keep calm, write on. There'll be varying levels of interest per each chapter you work on. Some of them you feel will be compulsory. Beat 3 of 10 is only there to move the plot along, or beat 6 of 10 is your sweet spot and you're really excited about that one, but 5 and 7 not so much. The point is that you gotta fight through those dull chapters. You're in a swamp and the mud is just clinging to your boots, and you just gotta yank your foot out and keep going forward. Because realistically speaking, there's gonna be so many opportunities later for you to essentially flesh out everything. In each draft, you'll have these epiphanies and these ideas that will make you want to go back to a previous chapter and add a detail here. A process I call breadcrumbing, and we can talk about that later. But if you fight through those dull chapters, just to keep you moving and getting you forward, it's going to pay dividends later, because you can just fill out those sections later as you get to the end of it. That's pretty much my spiel on book outlining, as far as making a consistent outline to make your book a stronger piece of goodness and whatnot. In conclusion, I would say that this method isn't the only method, and ultimately just to do what works for you, because we all write differently. This is the way that I write, and this is the way that I kind of approach writing, and it's helped a lot. There might be different takes on this process that you might find valuable. I would recommend, starting with something and then seeing what works and see what doesn't work. And lastly, to sort of end cap this, is remember that it's okay to not be famous. It's something that a friend of mine told me in a Bible study I was in, and he just brought it up in relation to something totally different, but it very much freed me from this expectation that every word I was writing was God's gift to the world and whatever. Just have fun with it, because if you don't have fun with something, you're never going to finish a book, because the process of finishing a book from point A to point B is grueling. And yeah, it took me 5 years to write my third book. It takes a while. It takes a lot of effort and energy and heartache. And what gets you through those hard moments is that it's still fun, and it's still yours, and it's still something that means something to you. So I would just encourage you all to think of it that way. It's okay to not be famous. Not everyone can be famous, because that's the whole point, is that if you're famous, it's usually like a tiny group of people, and then everyone else are like the normal people. But it's okay to not be famous. Keep thinking that through your head. So thanks for watching. If you liked what you see, please like and subscribe to my channel. I'm gonna keep trying to make more of these videos. I hope it was helpful, and yeah, have a great day.